No, this is great. Perfect. It's like Philip's class.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm very honored to welcome Jill Desimini, who's coming to us from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and she has degrees from Brown and University of Pennsylvania. She's a professor of landscape architecture, and her research involves sort of the latent potentials in outdated infrastructure and trying to encourage productive economic, social, and cultural agendas within that infrastructure. Today she'll be talking about landscape strategies to address shrinking cities. Please join me in welcoming Jill Desimini.
Excellent. How's the volume? Good? Awesome. So it's really nice to be here. I want to thank you guys for the opportunity, and it's been a really fantastic 2 days that I've been able to be here. And it's also really nice to be again in a very lush landscape and a sort of beautiful campus. I enjoyed my drive down the sort of productive Willamette Valley, sort of remembering what productive landscapes could be and feeling sort of very envious, especially considering the large amount of snow and 20-degree weather we had in Boston at the beginning of the week. So I'm from Portland. I know it rains here, but this is so idyllic, so I'm really happy to be here. And I'm going to talk today about the mundane. It's going to be very boring, so you can all fall asleep if you want. And so not necessarily about the kind of wonderful, inspiring, and innovative architecture that we've seen in the past few days, or really about my own design work, but rather about a collective project that kind of relates to the design and evolution of cities. So in that sense, I guess I'll be building a little bit on some of what Adam started to talk about earlier, but from a slightly different angle. And I'm offering my thoughts on what I call urban residues, or land left over as development shifts, as parts of cities are abandoned, as land is made free and available, but left stigmatized and fallow. I'm interested in the way that larger political and economic decisions shape our built environment, the way we read these landscapes, and the way in which, as designers, we can proactively respond. So I love your sort of prompt to think about the idea of response. So I wanted to start with something very personal, with a draw I have to these two particular landscapes. It's kind of blurry, maybe. I don't know if that's... I don't know. It's a little bit blurry. Is it blurry to you or just me? Okay. All right. Awesome. So I wanted to start, as I said, with something personal and a draw I have to these two particular landscapes, but also an uneasiness I have with what I would call their irreconcilable differences. The two images, when taken out of context, have some similarities. They're rich forests, stacking growth stands that infuse a certain kind of life in the city. Forests that bear marks of past production and inhabitation, that exist because of challenging development conditions in the land, socioeconomic unrest on the one hand, and erosion on the other. So to understand and intervene in these landscapes is to construct their past, present, and future context. Both have grown out of fragile terrains as responses to human-driven alterations to the landscape. But the similarities end there. The past occupations are distinctively different, the present environments without comparison, and the projected futures divergent. Yet in placing these landscapes and other, what I would say, adopted and rejected residues in broad contexts with odd relationships is to start to imagine a potential future that can depart from dominant narratives of loss. Presently, these are two opposite cities, one defined by social and industrial decline, in the case of St. Louis, and the other by growth and innovation, one divided distinctly in many different ways, and one more unified, one relatively flat and one with considerable topography, one mild and temperate and the other harsh and humid. The forests are not overly different socioeconomic and biogeophysical climates. They come from different eras. Forest Park, first recommended by John Olmsted as part of his 1903 city plan for Portland, was established as a city park in 1948 as a means to structure a growing city at the tail end of a time when large reserves were being set aside in American cities as valuable resources. The ruderal forest in St. Louis emerges out of a delay in development. one extremely stigmatized on a site with remnant city infrastructure and building debris. Shaped by the continued dumping of construction material, here, I'm having some fun imagining it on the centenary anniversary of national parks as a new kind of national park, one coming from the formerly urban rather than the formerly wild, because in many ways, the urban here is a contemporary wild. So if we built big parks at the turn of the last century, the question is how we will address the many acres of fallow and vacant lands as this century turns. How will we think about the spontaneous? Will it always be subservient to the cultivated? And I ask this right now, especially because the Pruitt-Igoe site is about to see significant change. After more than 40 years, the National Geospatial Agency, which is the mapping agency arm of the government, announced last Friday that it would stay in St. Louis, relocating to the area around the Pruitt-Igoe site rather than leaving the city for a cornfield in Illinois. The decision represents a shift in behavior for the government, an investment in the city as a place with greater intellectual and human capital than elsewhere. So instead of moving to a more remote sites where the required building security is easier to achieve, they will stay in the city. But the facility requires a 50-foot buffer and a giant footprint that will again involve land takings. From an economic standpoint, the NGA decision to stay in St. Louis is a win for the city. A significant job loss averted, but urbanistically there are still many questions. From the gated-like complex that it represents, to the additional land appropriation, to the large expanses of proposed impervious surface, to the imposition, again, from the outside on a disenfranchised community. So while Forest Park remains a site of arboreal exploration in the city and an anchor of stability, the spontaneous forest and its disinvested neighborhood will evolve through outside pressure, perhaps without clear intention as how to balance short-term economic necessity with medium-term community goals with the long-term evolution of the land and the city. So in starting with those two kind of parallels, I want to talk about two themes that are going to set the foundations for a design project in Lisbon that I'll kind of describe at the end of the talk as an example of kind of some of these themes. And as Adam mentioned, as landscape architects, we're obsessed with time. So I'm going to start with a lot about time. Cities are enticingly rich and complex. They are entropic and unpredictable places with long histories of development. They are by definition in constant flux, responding to economic, social, and environmental trends, alternating between periods of sprawl and periods of spatial concentration. So as we design for these conditions, and especially in situations where resources are extremely limited, we need to think about how time is embedded in the project and how the project is in fact managed over multiple timescales, from the diurnal, or maybe the hourly, to the geologic. And so as landscape architects, we are very obsessed with time. I think as a society, we're often a bit short-sighted about it. And so at the top of this, I started with a kind of time scale that is fiscal, that's in quarters, where we measure the change that happens every 3 months, and we really track daily change. So in this case, a year is a long time. But our systems and economics are not set up for the ebb and flow of longer timescales of those of population. American history is shallow, and we have come to expect what we have seen in the past, fast growth as the only model of urbanization. So it's time to look at other timescales, from the tree, the rock, and embrace slow time, long cycles of change, and different kinds of cities. And as we have seen, it is with time that the effects of abandonment become evident, that the results of human stewardship and neglect register profoundly through the urban landscape. It could be argued that time scale of urban abandonment is both shorter and longer than that of occupation. So on the one hand, you have this issue of durable goods. Buildings are erected quickly with demand and removed very slowly without it. And on the other hand is this relatively quick evacuation of populations that happens with conflict, with weather and geologic events, with economic and political change. And so the measure of transformation depends on the mobility of actors and agents, and the physical characteristics and scale of the site. So as people and programs are shifting, they're capable of flowing like a river, to use the American planner and conservationist Benton MacKay's analogy to describe American migrations from westward expansion to metropolitan sprawl. So we move a lot, and this type of change is probably more aptly defined as translocation than transformation. The movement is rapid and fluid rather than slow and halting. Empty receptacles are left behind, dry riverbeds without the water that shaped them. And it is these dry riverbeds, the residual urban formations, that are resistant to change. Adaptation of the built fabric to new models of inhabitation, new environmental conditions, and new support systems is a project of decades and centuries. Given the slow process of change and abandonment, how do we address the residual landscape? How do we see it again as something other than derelict and fallow? So to do so, it is necessary to look both closely at the slow change that is happening and kind of embrace it as this kind of pause required for invention. So if we expand our references to time, then cities that may appear to be in decline in the short term may ultimately come back as transformed versions of their former selves over the course of years or decades or centuries. So we could take Rome. It's the classic example. People always talk about it. At its height in 100 AD, the city had a population of over 1 million people. And then by the end of the Gothic Wars in 554 AD, it had 30,000 people. So yet, of course, we all know Rome rebounds, right? It gains population steadily from the 1800s onwards to once again surpass 1 million people in the 1930s and 2.75 million in 2010. So we could look to Detroit. It's one of 350 global cities that have experienced a steep decline in population since the 1950s, and it's the poster child of urban shrinkage. In the context of right now, its prospects might look dire, but in the context of longer cycles of cities, Rome represents hope for places like Detroit, whose present-day situation is unsettling. So if we continue to think on a 50-year timescale, we fail to see that both growth and decline are part of the overall urban trajectory, and it becomes difficult to imagine a turnaround when deep in the recesses of contraction, just as it is difficult to foresee decline in times of growth. So this is a 1930s article from 1930s that's sort of starting to think about this idea of maybe growth changing as growth is actually changing. But at the same time, it's arguing that it's reporting that Detroit's able to cut down trees and plant skyscrapers, which I think is an amazing idea. So it's the kind of first article where this notion of urban shrinkage comes into play, and it's also a notion that we're basically cutting down trees and planting these skyscrapers that today, in a kind of strange reversal, we see these woodlands emerging in the vicinity of those same skyscrapers that are sort of now crumbling. And then we see the city and other investors actively planting trees. The newly minted planting director, who's Maurice Cox, claimed that as the city demolishes 250 vacant structures per week, it will plant trees, 1 million per year. And on a slightly smaller scale here, this is the Hants Woodland project by a sort of local business magnate that's aiming to cultivate 200 acres of land that he's purchased into the city. And planting began in May 2014, and to date they have 20,000 trees that they've planted by volunteers on 20 acres, which include largely saplings. And then to give people an idea of the future, they started planting sugar maples at a larger scale to give a sense of what the future urban woodland might look like. And even when the city appears stagnant, it's changing. Yet the patience for this slow and perhaps invisible transformation doesn't exist. And inertia starts to mask a different type of growth. But this isn't to say that the city merely returns to its previous state, from forest back to forest, but rather that as it travels through time, the city is layered, gathering materials and knowledge like a snowball. The goal is not to dwell in past lost, but to see the urban landscape as capable of evolution, not just in spite of its ups and downs, but because of them. And it's important to start to look back and forth at cities in different stages of development to see potential value in the land and how it can be used to restructure. When the idea of an urban land conservation project was proposed in Boston here in the 1970s, the city was in a very different place, in a one of those seemingly bottomless pits of decline, with vast swaths of vacant and undeveloped land. And here, this was a project to give the land value through a program of the city to sort of define wilds and acquire the land in a way that it could structure the city and start to reflect both its geologic substrate and its development history. So to preserve marshes like these, that on the one hand look just like a marsh, but on the other hand are created on a site where they took a geological formation, a drumlin. Then they built a 19th century park on top of it with a parkway and extended houses up to that they then raised and removed for the expansion of the airport, which was an extension of the runway that in turn changed the hydrologic flow of the bay and led to the establishment of this marsh. And the site itself recently opened to the public view and can be accessed as a means to reconnect people to the water along the entire Boston shoreline. And it's something you can see in an amazing way as you fly over, such as I did just a couple days ago. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was an interest in wild spaces in the city. And it grew as a means to counter environmental degradation and to create value out of urban wastelands. A project that's sort of undertaken both by design advocates in this case and by urban ecologists. And so they're sort of saying, we have this deep-seated necessity to domesticate the wildness we find in our cities as opposed to lose it entirely from our lives, because this is kind of where the wildness resides. It no longer really resides anywhere else. And so if you have these protagonists, the sort of the number one protagonist is an urban ecologist named Herbert Sukop and his colleagues who are working in Berlin, and they're probably the most instrumental figures in this process. They closely observe and documented the biological succession occurring in a pause, a very particular pause, created between widespread wartime destruction in 1945 and the kind of post-unification reconstruction beginning in the 1990s. There's sort of these urban ecologists stuck in West Berlin. They want to go explore something that they're used to exploring, but they have nothing around them. They're on this island. So they start to look within West Berlin and say, what can I find? What can I look at? And they picked sites, like the site you saw before, and they mapped them intensely. They looked at the species over a kind of almost 50-year period. And through this rigorous field work, they kind of recognized a correlation between species composition and the structure of the city. A relationship that Sukop idealized in this, which is his emblematic cross-section of Berlin. He thought of the city as a pluralistic entity, which I think is something as designers we tend to do as well. That the city was a mosaic. It could be understood through its biotypes whose classifications indicated the extent and types of human use, which is kind of radical. We don't usually think about the scale of human use related to a biotype. In German, they have a word for it. It's called Hebronomy, and basically you get a scale, and it kind of affects, how much intervention has there been. So the biotype, it's formed from the Greek roots for life and space, is a habitat defined by the long-term associations between its specific floral and faunal species. And so these ruderal compositions that they're starting to observe, those that are happening on these rubble piles, are differentiated from other types of vegetal cover, from forests, bogs, and grasslands. And it's a system that's kind of endured and kind of remarkably been ingrained into the identity of Berlin. So Berlin is a city that, despite its density and diversity, is nearly half vegetated. And it considers great distinction in the types of vegetation, indicating historical evolution and the process of succession. So vacant land is differentiated from places with immature soil, from places that are dry and neglected grassland, from a kind of fallow greenland. Beginning in the 1980s, This biotic potential became a way to evaluate urban land, and Sukup argued that urban development types themselves could be reframed as biotypes, and that development decisions could be based on these biotypes. He used his research to support a theory of urban ecology and as a basis for policy, explored through the development of the Species Protection Program. Sukup and his colleagues created these types of biotope maps of the entire city based on their early field work, and they were designed to promote a valuation system that considered the existing species in order to determine whether a site should be conserved, maintained, or developed. And I think if you do work in Berlin to this day, this is both an amazing and really frustrating idea, because you're sort of hemmed in. You have to kind of not displace anything and yet build intensively. And so it exists, it continues today, and I think because of those constraints, it leads to some really interesting types of work and projects that come there. The biotype mapping continues today as a means to assess and conserve existing habitat and to drive habitat creation in heavily developed areas. The urban ecologists had discovered rare species, like a French moth who came on war trains, and this exuberant nature living in the city's abandoned spaces. The stagnation of development associated with the structural divide in the city created these exotic habitats, and these habitats warranted some form of conservation in a heterogeneous city. So what they did was they changed the thinking about what was growing in the city. They argued for the urban wild to be considered as a legitimate open space typology, one dependent on human influence to exist and kind of human insight to remain. And after reunification, many of the wilds sort of disappear, while others become incorporated into a distinct set of urban landscapes that follow the kind of old rail infrastructure down the spine of the city and create this north-south corridor in the urban core. And these images start to show what is the kind of deft incorporation of the wild landscape into a highly used mobility and recreational amenity for the city, with cutouts for traditionally undervalued species that provide a richness and diversity in what is a kind of fantastic large park with all of the amenities that large parks have, and where bold interventions are set against spontaneous forests, creating a culture of openness and new types of open space that allow for different human uses and engagements. So instead of trying to fight what are sometimes called alien or immigrant plant species, they're integrated into a rich and considered landscape design project. And I would say that this spontaneous vegetation is a product of time, but it's an integral part of the residual urban landscape everywhere. Landscapes that can be considered as a form of commons for the city. So this commons is the second big idea that I want to touch on, and sort of argue that this idea of commons as a kind of physical typology, as a landscape rather than a metaphor, has a clear place in this context of urban retrenchment. And so it's a complex and loaded term. And this is where I get to the fact that it's all very, very boring. It denotes something shared and inherently not private. So it's a common thing that we have together, but it's also something mundane and ordinary. And that's kind of a particular interest in this context. The definition of the commons is tied to land use rights and property as well as to a spatial and aesthetic characteristic. And here, from a sort of more dictionary standpoint, it describes open lands where community members have rights of use as well as collective commodities. It's a spatial, political, and cultural landscape, in the context of economic scarcity, one that is commoditized. So if you're referring to the British Commons, the specific legally defined extractable goods are the right to graze, to fish, to make turf for fuel, and to take wood. And it comes at a time when basically the common landscape is defined as its shared utility. So this is a U.S. geological map of Southern California from 1881. And what's kind of interesting about it is it uses a land use system, classification system that's based on commodity. And so the kind of key to it is that this land is 43% grazing, 20% a kind of scrub timber, 9.7% timber, 13.5% agriculture, and then in contrast to what is basically perhaps valueless in this case, or 9.5% barren. And this idea of a productive landscape is often applied to the contemporary abandoned landscape as well, where economic and environmental pressures drive a dialogue about performance. And the cyclical nature of engagement, again, becomes very literal, with old steel mill sites becoming wind farms, with cities defined by their resources, which they then try to celebrate, in this case, water in Dayton. Dayton has a lot of water, and yet they can't bring people there. And land use is transitioning in a strange dialogue of farmland disappearing on the periphery and reinserting itself, mostly on small scales, into the urban fabric, creating perhaps interesting juxtapositions and possibilities like this, which is called Chateau Howe in Cleveland. It's a vineyard experiment. I know, not exactly agriculture in its pure form, but you've all seen an urban farm. So the vineyard here, it's on common lands, and it's had a kind of rough beginning in the sense that the grape seedlings were basically, they couldn't compete with an ingrained idea that you clean and green everything, that you mow over everything. And finally, through many, many tries, has sort of managed to establish. So if we step back to this commons for a minute, we're going to start to unpack it as a kind of elusive and, again, cyclical idea. So these ideas are very much interrelated. And to make the argument that the commons is most relevant when the land to population ratio is favorable, when economic scarcity drives the need for collective action. And so we'll say the North American common began as a shared property among the landed gentry that's evolved considerably with time. So it lost currency as the population rose and as private land ownership and commerce increased. And the number of land-owning citizens grew. So at this point, the fixed common was unable to support pasture and agricultural needs. Limited resources were exploited, and production moved from common to private land. The residual town commons transitioned from a kind of ownership by the people to an ownership by the town, and from a shared resource to a kind of center of commerce to basically an underfunded public lawn that you see in the east, dominated by traffic and mobility. So only in times of collective need, past economic downturns and war, has the communal function been momentarily recovered. So out of this very nascent timeline that's rough and probably the text way too small, like some other texts, to read, I want to pull out a few moments that speak to the trajectory of the commons in the United States while touching on its British origins. Perhaps this is a little better. But basically, to generalize, over the past 900 years in Great Britain and the past 250 in America, common land has been enclosed, parcelized, and distributed, and then released or co-opted in moments of defense and economic need. For example, when the military or defense needs assumed 13,000 acres of land in 2 years in 1942 for its operation, or on another scale when food production took over Boston Common as a war response. This ever-increasing privatization and parcelization has touched all aspects of common and public lands, to the point that when we look to privatize as much as possible at this point. And so if the public-private parks partnership was a new management structure in the relatively recent history, and would say that the late 1970s were this time of great optimism for the private savior. So you have this Renaissance Center that opened in Detroit in 1977, designed as a 7-skyscraper megastructure that was meant to catalyze the city. And so this privatization peak follows by both a recession of the 1970s that once again saw an increase in community garden and subversive action, and the growing concern for environmental degradation, which leads to a kind of legislative and organizational response. So in these cases, it has the effect of preserving common lands in a kind of desired state. You can think about wilderness or historic preservation. At this time, Garrett Hardin publishes his seminal 1968 article in Science describing the tragedy of the commons as people's propensity to mismanage the environment and other shared resources, to put individual need over collective good. It's an idea so powerful that it's revisited 30 years later in commemorative issue. So basically, at this point, the commons are considered not a very productive way of thinking. But since then, you have influential thinkers like political economist Elinor Ostrom and evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson that have produced counterclaims suggesting that collective action is possible and productive. So now we'll just jump ahead. We're in this era of climate change where arguments have been made that the sky, as an unowned collector of waste byproducts, is a new form of commons, where technology both suggests virtual commons and greater focus on the individual. You sort of see the rise of the selfie, but where there's also a continuing preoccupation with growing inventories of abandoned lands that could be a sort of issue and an opportunity facing a lot of cities. The idea of these landscapes as commons is by no means revolutionary, yet comfort with the idea that they remain unclaimed is hard to come by, suggesting a need for a specific design approaches to address the fragmented yet expansive footprint of these newish common lands. So the spatial typology has evolved a lot since here. These old commons, these ones that have gone from pasture to centers of commerce to lands, to these lawns, have similarities with the emergent commons, but really the complexity of issues and lands today kind of renders these obsolete. And though the traditional commons once performed, if only in a symbolic manner with 70 cows, they are now entirely symbolic spaces, with Boston Common being the quintessential example. And where the cows and the sheep left in 1830, and the space has just lost some of its original looseness, a looseness that perhaps has been transferred to a residual landscape to paint a kind of different picture of the city, and to places where spontaneous vegetation has been incorporated into the design spaces of the city. So to a large degree, the qualities of the commons, communal utility, spontaneous appropriation, and unplanned transformation have shifted to the abandoned and unclaimed spaces of the city. And as this common emerges, there is a lack of conceptual rigor defining these spaces, as well as the impossible predicament of maintaining publicly owned lands without any resources or support that plagues their operational potential. And so basically you see the slow transfer of land from a private ownership to public hands through abandonment and tax foreclosure that leads to land banking, as we see here in a well-known example in Flint. But once the land is banked, there is no money to maintain it and no public vision for its future. And yet the design community has been preoccupied with this terrain vague for decades. And so through a few key projects, all that operate at scales from the parcel to the region, all that are public in the sense that they are led by government initiative and address commonly held land, I'm trying to identify design strategies that address this form of commons. And they're strategies that are related to and expand on the old notion of a commons as a physical landscape, strategies that address the needs of the commons to be economically nimble, to be scalable with time, to have shared utility, to remain public, and to be ordinary. And ultimately, I believe the design strategies should operate much in the way that the acts of legislation on the timeline led to the definition and devolution of the commons. But for now, I'm just going to explore them for their physical and spatial deployment and their scalability. And so while I'm interested in shared threads and agendas and tools, I'm also interested in the particularities of each physical terrain, the social context and political climate, the economic systems, and the design culture. Instead of projecting a catalog of all possibilities, I'm trying to understand the building of the commons more deeply as an incremental project over time, one with many phases and actors engaged implicitly and explicitly in a shared work of spatial design. And so I'm going to look at just one of these projects in Lisbon, where the terrain is phenomenal, and the sky is quite transcendent, the soil fertile, but where the terrain is also fragile, subject to flooding and earthquake, as well as socioeconomic and political uncertainty. It's a shrinking city and a difficult economic situation, much like the others we've looked at. And the fragile terrain has inspired significant ecological planning in the recent history of the city. And this is a kind of scheme from a plan for that ecological structure, led by the landscape architect G. Rivera Tellish, who's kind of the best-known landscape architect in the country, and interesting because he's both a political figure and a spatial designer. And he proposed a green structure for Lisbon's metropolitan area, which is what this sort of schematic diagram points to. And he did so in response to kind of flooding and environmental failure that he blamed on a design community and blamed on sort of these large towers that were built in the floodplain. And the structure here is its schematic form, basically has a series of east-west bands moving across. The first band including peripheral areas of large parks. Monsanto is one. There's a set of eastern parks around Čeleš that we'll look into a little bit more. The second band are some state-owned properties and public housing, and the third band is along the riverfront. And basically, you have those bands and then these sort of radial spokes that follow the valleys that are kind of running transversely through the swatches, which is probably much perhaps clearer to see these peripheral bands, this river band, and then these radial valleys coming up through. In this, which is basically the city adopted that plan as an official master plan in 2007 and redefined it into this map, which is a proposed ecological structure for the city. And basically they adopted this as an aspirational structure. And since then, the municipal government has been planning and designing small projects. So this is a kind of map of all of those small projects that they've completed since 2007. They're incremental and piecemeal, but they're not unsubstantial, especially given the economic and political climate. So if you go into the office of the director of the division responsible for this, which is the Municipal Division of Green Structure, Environment, and Energy, he basically has behind him 700 white project binders and this pinkish red map that's hopefully becoming redder and redder with time that documents the work on the Plano Verde. And so this map shows, as I said, all of these little ecological infrastructure projects extracted and then seen overlaid on the ecological plan. And so basically they're like kind of acupuncturally trying to create this plan. And the small fragments aggregate to form interconnected territories within the built fabric. So if the plan emerged out of a very rough tracing, you can imagine, a kind of early technology of an aerial image and a kind of visionary landscape architects kind of trying to connect green in an idealistic way without any regard for property, politics, and people. This is the kind of ground truthing of that, where the city is slowly building these series of small landscapes. They're like inlays designed to address this kind of environmental concern of flooding and earthquake, and a kind of socioeconomic concern of food security, immigration, and poverty. And in this, project, the valleys are fundamental. They don't just connect the bands, but they're necessary to improve the social and ecological quality of life in the city. So they're conceived of as a means to encourage urban ventilation, to channel air currents up from the water into the congested areas of development, and they're also the best places for planting. So the production of this valley becomes a kind of environmental project and a cultural project that's trying to retain the traces of what is the city's very rich agricultural history and still serve as a kind of reserve, as a little bank for the current inhabitants. So we're going to zoom into Čeleš. So this is one of those valleys, which is the Čeleš Valley. And we're going to look into it to kind of interrogate it as a common landscape for its residents. So this is the kind of Čeleš region. And basically, Čeleš and the surrounding district of Oliveš, which are the areas just south and east of Lisbon's airport, were kind of loosely occupied agricultural sites in 1959. This terrain, it was technically part of the city, but it was considered rural and unutilized with this really intense topographic condition that previously had prevented building, but at this point in 1959, the municipal government, sort of armed with a lot of political power and a lot of faith in modernism was kind of unfazed. For them, this is the eastern front of the city. It's going to be perfect for all of our new housing experiments. It's going to solve this crisis that we've basically constructed of a need for affordable housing. And so on basically 737 hectares, or 10% of the city's total airport area, they planned and kind of proceeded to execute 3 contiguous developments, which are Oliveixa Sul, Oliveixa Norte, and Cheles. And the Oliveixas were much easier projects. The land acquisition was easier, the design was more integrated, and they were capable of dealing with it. But the Cheles plan is the largest and most complex, but also the most dominated by what was a kind of housing-centric and technical concern of the government. So they divided it into zones of housing. These are the zones I, J, L, M, and N, with a commercial zone in the middle, which is this bar, which is O. That's going to link all of these clusters into a district. I think the plan kind of looks like lungs, but unlike the Oregon, which sort of moves air effectively, this plan really can't circulate any activity through its tissue. And part of its failure has to do with the phased implementation of the plan. So this is the plan in 1965. They're basically still building parts of this plan today. It's been executed over many, many decades and many political regimes and many situations. A part of it's due to its lack of connectivity and giant road infrastructure. So you see there's only a few crossings of the major valleys. There are these 6-lane highways. They're very intense. And part of it has to do with the fact that they never designed the public realm or the communal spaces. So these oversights together represent a paucity of investment in the public realm and a gross misunderstanding of the topographic condition of the area. So this is the kind of situation of the terrain now, and you basically see, you can kind of see it in context with the rest of the fabric around the city. And here you see these, they provide housing units, and basically housing units alone. So the buildings are constructed on ridgelines, which you'll see a little bit better in the photographs, and away from this valley drainage system, which makes sense. But the valleys basically sit between them with no direct connections across. To move between the zones on the provided routes is nearly impossible as a pedestrian or a motorist. The planners do not fully understand the difficulties that the steep valley sides pose for connection, and so instead of adapting the previous grain of development, which, not in a nostalgic way, but in a way that understood how those roads and things could navigate the terrain, instead they imposed this cellular system comprised of linear and disconnected developments. And yet you have these developments that have all of this kind of open space around them, which is city-owned property, but has no clear sort of claim of that ownership or that identity. So in this absence, the local, mostly African immigrant population has been resourceful in using the spaces for gardening and production. And so we'll see, this is zone J, and if you look at the kind of valley over time, you start to see these hundreds of tiny little plots, and this is only in 3 years, basically. They're called hortas, and they've kind of emerged in the past decade, interspersed with the sort of century-old structures. And they kind of continue, and this happens all the way up the valley. So here the intrepid gardeners have discovered the drive of farmable soil, and in a way the appropriation occurs everywhere in this valley. And in fact, not just in the valley, but there are 700 of these hortas in Greater Lisbon. They're an ingrained part of the city's culture, as well as a manifestation of food shortage for certain populations. The urban gardening and farming is a typical response to abandoned property, but in this case, the pervasiveness of the installations, the emerging government support and structure, and the design quality point to something else, to this kind of idea of commons that could emerge. And so here you have them across the valley, and everywhere there's these little lines through the section. There are big installations of these hortas. And so they're not like typical gardens for me, but rather represent a robust infrastructure for the city, one built in conjunction with a larger ecological and social agenda. So they fit within this valley system at the scale of the city's ecological structure, and they address the cultural concerns of adjacent residents who are the stewards of these landscapes. So in essence, this becomes a municipal project. And so here you're going to see an example of it. But the city has been started to build out of these communities these sort of horticultural projects that organize and embed the individual agricultural practices within the ecological structure of the city. So you kind of see a before and after of how that terrain is being organized and how the city has basically developed a typological landscape to augment and valorize the current cultivation practices and extend this patrimonial lineage of productive landscapes while providing a safe and healthy growing practice to the residents. Because basically, Lisbon has a significant dry season, and so they were basically appropriating this land and also appropriating sewer water for its irrigation and then selling the sort of products from this. It came this kind of public health crisis, and the city felt like they needed to sort of force them to intervene. And so in order to kind of enhance the project and perhaps improve public perception of the gardens, the projects merge an agricultural agenda with recreation and mobility. So you have various types of programs, skate parks, playgrounds, other kind of sports fields that are placed within these tracks that are largely devoted to gardening, and then this whole set of bike and pedestrian pathways that move through the allotment landscape. But most important, basically, they provide for crop irrigation. And so here you see this horticultural project in Chalish a little bit in relationship to the terrain and to the landscape. And I would say it can be considered a contemporary form of a landscape common when where land is collectively cultivated through understated means. It's achieved through the careful organization of very, very quotidian design elements. So you have a shed, you have a spigot, you have a fence, you have a path, and you have a terrace. These insertions, plus this kind of facilitated process of plot assignment and negotiation and a contract, yield a shared ecological and cultural amenity. So essentially, as part of this process, there was a huge engagement process with the farming community, such that they had to sit there and actually negotiate who was going to share each one of these sheds. So each of the sheds are sort of shared by groups of 4 people. So the city owns the land. They transfer the right of use to the farmers, and the design of the terrain becomes a form of mediation of both social and physical landscapes. The allotments are clustered around these shared sheds that serve as both water and access points. And then you have rows of these allotments clustered to form terraces such that they can occupy the steep terrain. Water is managed as it descends into the valley, and the public can move around, basically freely through the site in the spaces that are between and around these enclosed gardens. Occupation is promoted, managed, and regulated. The commons have rules, and this contemporary reinterpretation is no exception. It's a right to use the land, but that right comes with responsibilities for the cities and its farmers. So what I would say in a kind of near-tragic architectural turn, the project's banality is what makes it remarkable. The design is accomplished without trying to do too much. It's analogous to an introvert whose quiet, listening presence is welcome in a room of loud extroverts jockeying for attention. The design embodies the rough elegance of its terrain. It adapts the intrinsic structure of previous allotments and respects the grain of the topographic condition, which is extremely steep. You can kind of see the pathways coming down from the buildings. It generates a symbolic lushness through the water that celebrates the collaboration between city government and city dweller. And while there was a skepticism, and perhaps still is a skepticism on different sides of the project, from the pre-existing farmers who fear displacement to the general public who dislike the disorderly horses, so far the valley is working as a kind of respected social enterprise. And so, in a sense, the juxtaposition of the design and the customs, the practices of the spatial and the social is exemplified in the moments where the cane structures meet the red roof sheds. So the cane, which is called Arunda donax, is considered an invasive species in Portugal. It's widely used in agricultural practice as a material for building fences and for supporting plants. And so likely it's an ancient introduction from India into the Mediterranean basin, but this cane has been around for a long time, dividing land and supporting legumes. In the Chalish Valley, the farmers form teepee-like lattices to support the beans, which are a necessary ingredient for the Cape Verdean specialty of cachupa. The bean stalks wind themselves around the cane, overflowing at maturity, signaling bounty, sustenance, and life. The cane structures have a similar height and girth to the shed structures. They're light and ephemeral and seemingly transitory. By contrast, the shreds represent a more durable stamp on the terrain. On the one hand, they could be critiqued as too fancy for a garden shed. On the other, they signify a proud investment in the land and its farmers, designed to be lasting beacons of a sustained agricultural and social promise. The cane is flexible and accommodating, while the wood is a durable anchor. Both constructions signal an incremental investment in human capital that stands in stark contrast to the looming architectural leviathans on the hillside above. The project achieves a difficult balance between too little intervention and too much. The transformation of the site is clear, yet the qualities of the valley as it existed before remains. And the project adapts, much like the way in which the micro-topographies of the soil is adapted, and it works hard at these multiple scales, from the scale of the sort of soil and the grain to the scale of the individual and family, community, and region, to give a contemporary identity to something that is fundamental to Lisbon's DNA. So that how you have these old roots that are there, this kind of agricultural patrimony that's strongly anchoring the land, but so too are the new seedlings, signaling healthy prospects for this new terrain, this new and for this very contested terrain. So to end, I'm just going to return to the question of what is the next commons, the next shared resource for the city, which it could be this, it could not, and say that the idea behind conceiving of these landscapes, in this case the forest, is to offer a new way to consider how our fallow landscapes, to add value to these overlooked and residual spaces, to telescope across multiple physical and temporal scales and different climatic and material conditions to build a collective project. And so my goal with this work is to envision an emergent commons as a spatial design response suited to the condition of urban retrenchment, a simple idea that is often evoked but not fully fleshed out. And from this, to develop a conceptual framework and a set of design tools to render this commons operative. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
So, shown as Portas especially, it seems this idea of the commons is most successfully achieved with a collaboration between large-scale government and small local groups. It looks like oftentimes large government will kind of just throw policy in large swaths of land, and yet they don't work for the majority. And it takes local groups that work with the land to really know, like, how can we use this to the best effect for at least our local social government. Do you think that maybe providing a finer-grained government, more like neighborhood governments, district governments that can interact with locals at a much more intimate level would kind of achieve this outcome sooner? So you wouldn't have those Leviathan constructions at the beginning, but possibly more specialized structures.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good summary in a sense. I mean, I think in a way, as people who do some form of planning, there's a sort of like, I don't know, an elephant in a way. Like, these large scale projects sit there, and they're something that are very much in the collective memory of people, and make it very skeptical of large projects and the ability to do anything kind of large scale in the city. And so I do think that, yes, like, the more you can break down that scale or kind of work between them, I think conceiving of anything as kind of bottom up and top down is a pretty short-sighted. And what I kind of really like about this project is it is a little bit of a top-down project, in the sense that it was this kind of crisis, and then it's like you have this activity that's going on. People are sort of gaining economic ability out of the land that's been left, and then the government's going to kind of come in and change that. And I think in some senses it's an example where, at least at this point, that negotiation process was was actually a negotiation process rather than a kind of imposition. And also, it's something that happens at sort of multiple scales. So you have these very small increments, and then you have a way for them to kind of aggregate across the city and perhaps provide a larger infrastructure for the city. And so you have that negotiation between the kind of directly involved constituents, and then you have the kind of larger public perception of this project, of these gardens, which a lot of people see as or maybe which the general population doesn't appreciate and sees as a kind of disorderly landscape. So it's also an interesting project in kind of raising a kind of awareness and an appreciation for an activity that's pretty underappreciated, and maybe I think there's still huge. I mean, there's obviously still huge kind of social issues, but it's like a small project that at least starts to address some of them and manage to not actually displace, even to like almost wholesale change the terrain without causing displacement. And I don't think you see that very often, where something can be restructured in a way that's that doesn't cause displacement.
In Paris, there was some, in north of Paris, a lot of worker garden that is coming from the Second War. In fact, this tradition in Europe has been developed a lot during the Second War to feed people could feed themselves. In fact, this kind of lower class extension of their own house directly dedicated to their survival. And in Paris, it was the same. In fact, same, and now Paris is in globalization, so the speculation is growing up, so the value of the land is completely crazy compared to 30 years ago. So all the garden has been erased 10 years ago, because of course the forces of the transformation are stronger than the little garden. And we discovered that finally in the urban plans, this garden was kept as a future development, as a resource for the futures. So they were used as a social meaning, social common political statement, just to keep quiet the time where the price of the land was rising up, to resell or to renegotiate the value of the land. So it's exactly the garden in the Queen in New York during the 80s, 90s, what we call the nomadism transplanting garden, which were always moving depending on the pressure of the speculation, even moving the ground, in fact. What I see in Asia, where I'm living now, it's more, because if you look at the social condominium, they are extremely poor. Architecturally, it's a catastrophe. So we could understand that this romanticization of the garden as a compensation with a little barrack, with a little house in wood, as a romanticism compensation of the catastrophe of the architecture on the other side. So could we stop this compensation? By the way, could we more articulate the fact that landscape and architectures negotiate together as something more intricate, where when the speculation is growing up, you cannot so easily erase this compensation compared to the new value of the land. You know what I mean?
Of course.
And of course, Portugal. Lisbon is a permanent crisis. So there's no special pressure on globalization. So they are very lucky from now to keep their worker garden. But it's extremely risky as a development to separate so easily. So evidently, what the void in compensation of the density.
I think it's a great point. I like it. I mean, I think in a sense we're always, and the condition, two things. I think in the condition of abandonment, we're always in a kind of, we're in two states. We're in a sort of reactive state. We're in a state where anything is better than what's currently there. And we're in a state where we can't lose our eternal optimism that hopefully someday the development is going to come. And so I think it's a larger question of how you make. Landscapes are easily ripped out. Even the forest is going to go in a second. It's so much easier to sort of demolish them. So I think, if there was a way to kind of make the investment even more substantial, and a way in which you could make that investment in a time where no one wants to make the investment. I think that's the sort of question. Because you could build something that you wouldn't want to tear out in 50 years, but. Whereas
if I could compare in Bangkok, the city is a garden.
Yeah.
Meaning the construction, the building are dying, are reconstruct on themselves. There's no master planning, stupid master planning.
Right. Yeah.
Trying to freeze architecture
Yeah.
as an object, but more as a process of life and dying, reconstruction, where the voice integrate on the ruin. Is integrated as a kind of a Ruskin ruin, is integrated in the process of development. So you have the ruin and the abandoned situation on the ruin which are in dialogue together, which is finally more efficient when you don't have master planning.
Yeah, but you also have population.
Yeah, and you have density everywhere.
Exactly. That's good.
Okay, if there are any more questions, we're going to move along to our panel on technology and that's upstairs in 206. So thanks all for coming. Thanks again for being here.
So maybe the idea is to build something super high density, but in a really small footprint.
Yes.